The subway station hummed with the usual chaos. People rushing, announcements crackling, and the distant screech of an approaching train. Among the crowd, a tired-looking police officer stood near the turnstiles, his eyes scanning the platform with indifference. At his side, a lean brown furred dog shifted uneasily, its ears twitching at every sound. The dog, clearly a canine unit, wore a harness that marked it as part of the force. But something wasn't right. The officer's grip on the leash was tense, almost forceful, and the way he jerked it without care made a few onlookers glance uneasily. A sudden yelp broke through the station noise. The officer had tugged too hard, causing the dog to stumble back, its tail tucked low in fear. A few people exchanged looks, but in the busy rush of the city, most ignored it, hurrying along with their own concerns. One man, however, had been watching quietly from a nearby bench, his sharp gaze locked onto the scene. Dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans, he was easy to overlook. Just another commuter blending into the background. But beneath the casual attire was someone the world knew well. Keanu Reeves leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable, but there was a shift in his posture, subtle but certain. His eyes, deep with quiet intensity, stayed fixed on the officer. He had seen enough. The way the dog flinched, the officer's careless grip, the dismissive attitude. It didn't sit right with him. The officer had no idea that one of the most respected actors in Hollywood was watching. And more importantly, he had no idea that Keanu wasn't the type to just stand by. The subway doors chimed open, and the officer yanked the leash again, making the dog stumble forward. That was it. Keanu stood up. He didn't say a word yet, but his presence alone shifted the energy around him. A few people near him seemed to sense it too, pausing mid-step, their eyes following his movements. The officer still hadn't noticed him, but he would soon. Keanu moved with quiet confidence, his step steady, but unhurried. He wasn't one to cause a scene, but he also wasn't someone who ignored things that didn't sit right with him. The officer, still oblivious, dragged the dog forward, not bothering to check if the animal was struggling to keep up. The tension in Keanu's jaw tightened. He had spent years around animals, knowing their unspoken language. And right now, everything about this dog's posture screamed discomfort and fear. A few more people started noticing the silent standoff unfolding. A young woman near the subway map glanced at Keanu, then back at the officer. A man adjusting his tie slowed his pace, sensing something in the air. It was subtle, but the shift was happening. People were paying attention. Keanu wasn't a stranger to conflict. He had faced villains on screen, but real life was different. This wasn't a movie where things wrapped up neatly. This was a moment where someone had a choice, to step in or to look away. And Keanu had already made his decision. As he neared, the officer finally felt the weight of an unseen presence and turned. His expression was tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from years of routine. But his brows furrowed when he saw the man staring at him. "You all right there, officer?" Keanu's voice was calm, steady, not aggressive, not accusing, just a simple question. The officer blinked, taken aback. He recognized the face immediately. Who wouldn't? His grip on the leash loosened slightly, but his stance remained defensive. "Yeah, I'm fine. Why?" His tone held a hint of irritation, like someone who didn't want to be questioned. Keanu's gaze dropped to the dog, who now stood still, sensing the change in atmosphere. "Your partner doesn't look fine," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be forced. "You're pulling too hard. You notice that." The officer glanced at the dog, then back at Keanu. "He's a working dog. He's trained for this." Trained doesn't mean he doesn't feel, Keanu said, his voice unwavering. Dogs like him don't just work for you. They trust you. And right now, he's not sure if he should. The words hit somewhere deeper than the officer expected. A flicker of something, guilt, maybe, flashed in his eyes. But instead of responding, he scoffed, shifting his weight. Look, I don't need a lesson in handling canines. This is my job. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying him. I get that, he said. But the way you treat him, that's everyone's business. A few more commuters had stopped pretending they weren't watching. The energy in the station had shifted. It was no longer just about one man and his dog. It was about something bigger. The silent expectation that people wouldn't look the other way. The officer exhaled sharply, his grip loosening further. The dog, sensing the tension drop, wagged his tail hesitantly, eyes flicking between the two men. But the moment wasn't over yet, because just as the officer opened his mouth to respond, a new voice cut through the air. Everything all right here? A second officer had appeared, stepping onto the platform. His eyes flickered from Keanu to his colleague, assessing the situation. And just like that, the stakes had changed again. The second officer's voice cut through the tension like a blade, drawing everyone's attention. He was taller, older, with a steady presence that suggested years of experience. His eyes moved from Keanu to his colleague, then to the dog. Taking in the situation without rushing to judgment, Keanu remained calm, his posture unchanged. He wasn't looking for trouble, just fairness. The first officer, now aware of the growing number of eyes on him, shifted uncomfortably. The weight of being watched, of being held accountable, was setting in. He cleared his throat. "We're fine," he said, his voice lacking the confidence it had before. "Just a misunderstanding." The second officer's gaze lingered on him for a moment before settling on the dog. He crouched slightly, holding out a hand. The dog hesitated, but then stepped forward, tail still low, but moving cautiously. The officer gave a small nod. "He's nervous." Keanu spoke up. "Because he's not being treated like a partner." The first officer's jaw tightened, but the tension in his shoulders had already begun to drop. He looked at the dog, really looked this time, as if seeing him for the first time in a long while. The leash in his hand was slack now, no longer yanking or pulling. The dog glanced up at him, ears perked, waiting for a signal that wouldn't come through force, but trust. Silence stretched between them, heavy yet necessary. Then, in a quiet moment of understanding, the officer gave a small exhale. He reached down, running a hand over the dog's back. The animal leaned into it, a silent offering of forgiveness. The second officer stood, watching his colleague with something between expectation and approval. "You good?" he asked. The first officer nodded slowly. "Yeah," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Then, looking at Keanu, he added, "Didn't mean to be rough." "Long day." Keanu gave a small nod, accepting the words, but not excusing them. "We all have long days. Just remember, he's on your side." The officer met his gaze for a beat, then looked at the dog once more. This time, when he adjusted the leash, it wasn't a yank, just a gentle tug. The dog responded instantly, stepping in sync with him. No hesitation, no fear. The moment settled. The crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, satisfied that something had shifted. The second officer gave Keanu a knowing look before turning to leave. The first officer followed, quieter now, with his canine trotting beside him. No longer dragged, but walking by his side where he belonged. Keanu watched them go, then exhaled softly. It wasn't a grand victory, no dramatic confrontation, just a moment of awareness, a small shift in perspective, and sometimes that was enough. As the next train rolled in, Keanu stepped onto the subway, blending back into the city's rhythm, the moment passing like a quiet ripple in the vastness of everyday life. But for one officer and his partner, things wouldn't be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real win.